Let's return to our balance sheets to see how the banking system evolved to supply elasticity, and we'll also see how the same system disciplines that elasticity. Suppose we have a single bank, Acme Bank, with two depositors, you and me. Cash held by banks are known as reserves, and the liabilities for the bank are the deposit account held by me and the deposit account held by you. A bank's liabilities are usually much greater than its assets, which means deposit obligations far exceed reserves. But there are many banks, so suppose you and I bank at different institutions, me at Acme and you at Trusted. Now the balance sheets look like this. So each bank has reserves, and the liability for Acme is my deposit, and the liability at Trusted will be your deposit. Now, when I pay you, Acme could transfer reserves to Trusted, but that's burdensome to do all day long for every single transaction that occurs. So banks may prefer to wait until the end of the day and collect due tos and due froms, and then transfer only the nets, like Visa did with Blackwell's at the end of the day. So in the case of 4 banks, let's say we have Acme, Trusted, Worthy, and Best. This multilateral intraday trading tally for Acme could look something like this. So asset is going to be due from Trusted, liability is due to Trusted, and let's say the net is that there's a net due to Trusted at the end of the day. Again, assets due from Worthy, liabilities are due to Worthy, and suppose that we have a net from Worthy. Same for Best. So assets are due from Best, liabilities due to Best, and the net, let's say we have a net from Best. In each case, Acme would transfer reserves, dishoarding, to Trusted, and receive reserves, hoarding, from Worthy and Best. But that's still a lot of rearranging of cash reserves. Could set up correspondent balance accounts, such that Acme has an account at Trusted, and vice versa. That would look like this. So an asset for Acme is going to be its deposit at Trusted. A liability for Acme is going to be the deposit held at its bank by Trusted. And the asset for Trusted is its deposit at Acme, and the liability is its deposit from Acme. Now this is essentially a standing swap of IOUs. Let's say that at the end of the day, Acme owes a net to Trusted and needs to move retail deposits, which are the customer payments, to Trusted. There are 2 ways to do this under a correspondence scheme. Option 1 is that Acme accounts at Trusted are debited. Here's what that would look like. So Acme, assets, liabilities, Trusted, assets, liabilities, both have reserves. We are moving deposit accounts or retail accounts, customer deposits, from liabilities on the part of Acme to liabilities on the part of Trusted. So this, for example, I have paid you, so my bank now owes me less for my deposit, but your bank owes you more in your deposit. So in option 1, we're going to make this transfer by debiting the deposit account at Trusted, and then also debiting the deposit account from Acme, which means that Trusted has less of a liability to Acme, and Acme has less of an asset at Trusted. We'll notice that this way of operating correspondence accounts contracts the deposit accounts and reduces money, so you have net minuses. Now option 2 is where Trusted accounts at Acme are actually credited. So here's what that looks like. Setting up our balance sheet, Acme Trusted, assets, liabilities. Again, both banks have reserves. Now we're moving the retail deposits again from Acme to Trusted. But instead this time we're going to add money into the Trusted account. So the Acme increases its liability, and then Trusted increases its assets because it has money in its deposit account at Acme. So we see this method expands the balance sheets, the correspondent deposit account balances, and money. So we have net pluses. Historically, the more geographically central bank opted to accept deposits from the less central banks, and in practice, this meant that country banks' correspondent accounts in cities were frequently credited. We see remnants of this historic fact in the placement of the 12 Federal Reserve banks established in various cities, which served as the central banks with correspondence accounts from smaller regional banks. Another consequence of this choice of settling correspondence accounts through the second option is the establishment of a credit-based payment system. For a fully functioning multi-bank system, you'd need correspondence accounts between every pair of banks, and Acme may owe a net to Trusted at the same time that Trusted owes a net to Worthy. Ideally, Acme at the end of the day would just pay Worthy. Ideally, there'd be a single bank where all other banks held accounts, and nets would involve single rather than multiple credits and debits to various correspondence accounts at the end of the day. Clearinghouses perform this function of netting across all correspondence. Clearinghouses also serve the purpose of handling liquidity shortfalls by any single bank by lending from surplus accounts. The U.S. Federal Reserve System behaves much like a clearinghouse, and member banks have reserve accounts with the Federal Reserve. The system also has a counterbalancing disciplinary dynamic. Each bank is required to have a non-negative Federal Bank Reserve account at the end of each day. The survival constraint is thus relaxed for banks during the day, known as the daylight overdraft, but enforced every night through the settling of netted retail payment balances. Thus, we see a continual system expansion and contraction. Let's see how this works. Banks can run negative balances during the day. Here, Acme owes Trusted at some point in the day, but has insufficient reserves to make that transfer, so Acme obtains an automatic daylight overdraft from the Federal Reserve. So Acme incurs a liability, which is the overdraft, which is a loan, that's an asset to the Fed, so due from Acme. The Fed has an increased liability in that it's increased Trusted's reserves. Trusted has increased reserves as an asset. This is a clear expansion of reserves and of the federal balance sheet. Every dollar owed as overdraft by one bank is a surplus dollar in the reserve account of some other bank. Getting the credit off the balance sheet at the end of the day requires cancellation of both the negative accounts and the surplus accounts. The easiest way to do this is have banks with surplus accounts lend their surplus to banks with overdrafts. Fed funds are funds payable in Federal Reserve deposits and serve as a transfer mechanism from surplus accounts to deficit accounts. Let's say that at the end of the day, Acme has a net -10 reserve overdraft at the Fed. Here, the Fed facilitates a transfer from Trusted to Acme such that Acme can meet its overnight zero balance requirement. So Acme gets 10 added to its reserves, but incurs a liability of a 10 federal funds loan. The Fed increases Acme's deposit and decreases Trusted's deposit. Trusted now has -10 in reserves, so it has less reserves, but it also has +10 in a Fed funds loan. This is essentially a loan from Trusted to Acme, and the Fed transfers money from the Trusted Reserve account to the Acme Reserve account, and Trusted gets a Fed funds loan asset at the Fed funds target rate that is a liability for Acme. Fed funds loans are not Federal Reserve credit, like the daylight overdrafts which collapse at the end of the day, but interbank credit payable in reserve funds which get moved from one account to another without expanding the Fed balance sheet, rather by expanding the bank's balance sheets. Outstanding daylight overdraft credit can be several times as large as the outstanding deposits, and system elasticity is not contained by the quantity of reserves. But each night, the Fed balance sheet is resolved, and any outstanding overdraft loans are transferred to banks. Banks seeking loans to cover end-of-day payment deficit positions create the money market. Banks, dealers, and brokers all participate in the market, arranging for deficit banks' federal fund loans, repurchase contracts known as repos, or overnight collateralized loans based on certificates, stocks, bonds, or other commercial paper, such as loans to businesses. Bank crises arise when the value of the collateral posted in the money market comes into question, and lenders aren't willing to assist deficit banks in meeting their survival constraint. In the case of banks with Federal Reserve accounts, the Federal Reserve itself could lend on a restricted set of collateral to deficit banks at what's known as the overnight discount rate. We'll talk about discounting later. Thus, the Fed is known as the lender of last resort. But deficit institutions with linked balance sheets without reserve accounts and with no options to borrow, no saleable assets, no liquidity, can start a cascade of failure throughout the entire system. The Bordoskia et al. Paper in your reading list shows a model demonstrating instability in financial networks due to interlocking balance sheets and volatile asset prices. The shadow banking system refers to financial intermediaries that create credit, thus connect with other institutional balance sheets, but do not fall under the regulatory or lender of last resort system. These intermediaries could be dealers, mortgage lenders, brokers, private equity funds, or investment banks. The shadow banking system also refers to any unregulated activity by regulated institutions, such as credit default swaps. Here is a map of the shadow banking system by Stefan Morau, whose paper on the topic is in your optional reading list.